From my fiery heart to yours, welcome. Thank you for bringing your curiosity to this presentation, Just School, Just Growth, where we're going to look at the connections that are necessary for equitable outcomes for each student. So what we're going to be looking at, you can see the model in back of me, is what are those connections among our three big roads that we can take to support each of our students. If the last year has taught us a lot, right? And one of the things it's left us with is this the promise, the hope that we have in the midst of all this chaos. I know you have felt it over the year and a half, right? We have many aspects of our life has been dramatically changed, some for the way better. So when we look at where does the promise of education lie? To me, it lies at this recursive intersection, right? Because we know that we have adults and students in our caring circles who have had ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and that shows up as trauma in the body, which is a hyper-aroused nervous system. By the way, chronic stress, which we've all been under for 14, 15, 16 months, appears in the body as the same way. So we have trauma, chronic stress, adverse childhood experiences, and then we have social emotional learning, which social emotional learning helps heal the hyper-aroused nervous system. And then one of our other places is equity and social justice. So social emotional learning we've been doing since about 2015. We've got some traction with that. Through our lenses of social emotional learning, we've realized that many students come to us with wounds that we cannot see, but they certainly affect their ability to learn, to perform, to simply behave in a school setting. And the events of the past year has really brought into sharp focus that many underrepresented portions of our society have been left out of how we think about school, how we devise our curriculum. So we cannot accomplish social emotional learning in systems that don't have equity, right? Then we're just teaching human beings to be compliant and be victims. We need all three of these places. So why do we look at this model this way, right? If we know we have these three initiatives going on at any time, because it can be overwhelming, right? Right now, what do you think? Do we have the stamina to create these kind of learning spaces? I think we do. But if we don't consolidate and we don't make really clear, see clearly the connections among these three. So if you're a teacher, I just ask you to listen to, so you can hear for yourself, because when we see and make those connections, right, it tends to quell or overwhelm. If you're a teacher leader, if you're an administrator, if you're a board of ed member, if you're a central office, right? I've done this presentation to just about every stakeholder group in the system. Use your voice to let the educators know as we're coming back that, yeah, we have a lot to do. And it can seem overwhelming, but here's how everything's connected. And here's when we do this, when we're doing this professional development, or we're focused on this initiative, or we're doing this book read, that we're doing that in one of where cell, trauma, and equity and social justice overlap. So how we're going to do that today is we're going to look at the overview, the what, why, how. That's what I'm doing right now. Then we're going to look at what's the juncture of social emotion and equity? What does that look like, sound like, feel like in your classrooms? What can we do to further that? What are we already doing that's furthering that, right? Some of this is going to be just about validating what you're already doing. And then what's that? The intersection of cell and trauma. What are we already doing? What do we need to do more of? Is that where, are we going to focus some of our PD there this year? And then with the juncture where trauma and equity meet. And then we'll look at that a little bit. So in 40 minutes, we're not going to do too deep of a dive. It's going to be familiarizing you with the model, and then we'll look at a couple of them. We'll look at activities that we can do too. So I'm a really concrete how-to person, so there will be some of that. So who am I, right? I've just been talking with you for a few minutes, but never introduced myself. Pardon my rudeness. My name is Sharon McCarthy. I began Envision Breakthroughs in Learning in like 1999, 2000. I've been a PD provider locally. I come from the state of New Jersey, nationally and internationally for over 20 years. I consider myself a social emotional learning evangelist because my background besides education is human relations, cognitive psychology, neuroeducation. So that's my pilot house. But before we continue, I would like to acknowledge where I'm standing right now. In Ocean County in New Jersey. And I would like to acknowledge that where I stand right now is the land of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape people. They are the traditional custodians of this land. And I would like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present. And I'd like to extend that welcome to any Indigenous folks who are out there on this session today. And I acknowledge that this land on which I am was, and will always be Nanticoke Lenni Lenape land. So I'd like you to just take a second, take a deep breath, and acknowledge those first people, those Indigenous folks who cared for your land where you find yourself right now before you arrived. So it's school. We have to start with a pre-assessment or it won't feel like school. So here's your test, world changers. According to the Hot Dog and Sausage Council, how many hot dogs do Americans consume? That's Americans in the United States. Do Americans consume between Memorial Day and Labor Day, right? Because it's summer, happy summer. And it feels like one this year. Ready? Some of you have already asked Siri, but here you go. Wow, look at that number. And when we're in person, I see people counting like this to get their zeros. But that, you're right, 7 billion with a B hot dogs is what we consume. So now that we know it's really summer and we know what's on our menus for this summer, we can truly begin. So I know there's a lot of text on this slide. That's not my usual MO, but since this is only 40 minutes, we're not doing a whole, I just wanted to get as much information in front of you as possible. So when we look at here, if I make myself a little smaller and then I can zoom myself around, if we look first at this juncture right here between cell and equity, and that tease out boxes up here, what we're talking about is multicultural education, right? That's social awareness in cell language. And I know you're all doing that. You've been doing that forever. Congratulations. It's culturally relevant education, which is quite different from multicultural education, right? Goldie Muhammad is one of the experts on this, and it looks at, she really takes a dive into back when African Americans when they were still enslaved and did not have schools to go to, how they formed groups to learn, because learning was a shared responsibility. It was collaborative, and we learned to read so we could work on the world problems, right? It was words and world, which is kind of different than the expectations in our classrooms today, right? I hope we're moving away from it, but forever we've been individual and pretty competitive, right? So you can see that's a real difference. Sweet spot is about whoever I am, whatever my orientation is, culture, gender, ability, that in this curriculum, I have an access point because if I can't access, I'm never going to process. And if I don't process, I can't apply, and then no learning has occurred, right? We look at in that juncture between cell and equity, that's where conflict resolution lies, right? That's where I learned to use my voice to resolve conflicts, because conflict is a part of life. That is a cognitive skill that we are in dire need of, right? We look at neuroeducation, brain-based. I know all of you have brought that in because I've been in a billion schools doing neuroscience for education. So you see, when you look through this model, you can already check off, and we can, as a group, as a team, say, okay, here's where we want to go. This is what we've done. Good on us. Now, where do we want to go? And then when we look at, let's look at cell and trauma, this juncture right here, that's when we talk about self-regulation, resilience, that we have safe spaces in our schools. We understand that movement is really important. We get that the kids coming to us, or the adults coming to us, the adults who we teach next to, who have had a lot of chronic stress, a lot of ACEs or a lot of trauma, have these hyper aroused nervous systems, so they can be triggered quickly. So how do we get them through collaborative problem solving to look at what's a trigger and what do I do about it, right? And then finally, at the juncture right here, down here, that's trauma and equity. Restorative justice. If you're on the restorative, if you're doing circles, if you're looking at your data about who's getting punished, what are our rules even fair, or do they favor one kind of orientation, one kind of representation over another? All right. So that's what we're looking at today, those junctures. And of course, the sweet spot is where true growth happens when we are aware of power and privilege. That's self-awareness, looking at conflict resolution, that we understand that folks coming to us from a lot of stress, trauma, adverse childhood experiences, our punishment is about the worst thing we can do for them, right? That just re-traumatizes. So we're not going to get that system calmed where it can be in school. And then that's where our folks are seen, feel safe, feel connected. They're able to focus and learn, that access, process, apply. So the agenda did the overview, the what, why, how. Now we're going to get into social emotional learning and equity. Right here in this sweet spot, in that spot, that connection right there. Let me get myself out of it. And that's what we're going to be talking about next. So when we look at the intersection of cell and equity, what we see is there's work for there's work for everybody to do, right? And if you think that equity and social justice are going to be achieved with a checklist that somebody creates, equity begins with introspection, self-reflection, right? We talked about multicultural ed, conflict resolution, establishing those boundaries, right? That's self-management. Don't cross this boundary, and I won't cross yours. And then that neuroculturally relevant. We talked about that. So here's what I want to share with you. When we look to create the schools, right, the promise of where we can go as we create the future and not go back on a rubber band, here's what the social emotional learning competencies look like for you, okay, for the educators. So if you see the words in blue are regular, the competencies you've been putting in lesson plans for a few years, and then next to that, black and in italics, is how that becomes on the adult level. All right, so self-awareness for us educators becomes examining our identity. How well do you know yourself? Are you aware of your own power and privilege? Right? We all have power and privilege in the neighborhoods, communities, and families in which we sit. However, because right now I'm in the United States, the prevailing power and privilege is of those who look like me. So I can go just about anywhere in the country and enjoy this power and privilege I have. Now, in some communities, I wouldn't have power and privilege, right? But we work to understand where am I empowered and where am I not? What biases do I have? It doesn't mean you're a good or a bad person with biases. It's just the way our brain generalizes. So we all have them. What's negative is if you're not aware of them, right? We define our values and pursue purpose, right? That we live that balanced life. All right, self-management for us becomes exploring our emotions. What when do you respond, or how do you respond rather than react, right? What triggers you that you react in ways that afterward you wish you didn't, right? So how do I understand? And that's where I look at what are my triggers and how do I plan for them? That I recognize my physical emotions. Back when I was in the classroom, I was in grammar school. One of the teachers I taught next to taught second grade and hated sneezing, hated boogies. And like a kid would sneeze and she would recoil in like grotesqueness, which I felt so bad for these little kids. They were just sneezing. So, what recognize your physical reactions? Are they adding to a child's self worth, or are they taking away from a child's self worth? Relationship skills, right? That view behavior as communication, get curious, not furious, right? We know that from healing informed practices. We know we understand about behavior as communication and understanding that through restorative justice. Social awareness becomes orient towards optimism, and that's practicing gratitude. If you know me, we do more journals. That's something that's easy. The more your emotions, we are a very economical species. And what we do is we go to those emotions that we tend to have. So if you want to change, you start practicing more positive emotions, and then they become your more go-to emotions. Gratitude is a great place to start. And then responsible decision making. This is actually my favorite, because we know that, like with kids, we think responsible decision making is don't drink and drive, practice safe sex, get to school on time, those kind of things. We figure that at your age. So your responsible decision making is establishing balance and boundaries, understanding the cost of caring. Part of being an equity warrior is a self-care plan. You cannot keep up the stamina to create this awesome place we want to create if you don't take care of yourself. But that requires establishing boundaries, forming healthy habits. So speaking of forming healthy habits, I just want to tell you this one story. Back in before times, BC, before COVID, I used to travel a lot. And I'm one of those travelers. If you've seen me on the plane, I've got the noise canceling headphones in the window seat. Definite boundary. Don't talk to me. I'm not interested, because I'm usually processing a lot when I'm flying, right? I'm either going to present or coming home from a presentation. Except for this one time. I was coming home from San Diego, and this couple with so much energy came on the plane, and they sat in the two sets next to me. And this was the first conference they had ever gone to. They were so excited. They wanted to share what they learned, who they talked to, the Twitter folks they met, the tweets. They had a tweet meetup. I mean, I heard it all, right? But then we hit some turbulence. And one of the couple who was sitting next to me, eyes got really big, breathing got really shallow, like indicators that I recognize as, whoa, this is getting scary. With that, luckily, the pilot came on the all call and said, "We're in this turbulence. I can see on the radar. We'll be out of it. Just hold tight. In 3 minutes, we'll be back to normal." And I watched my seatmate take a deep breath, and we made it. We landed, and then we started talking. All right. So, in that story, who did you picture as the couple who sat next to me? Because your brain does. When you hear words, your brain automatically creates pictures. Was it a Hispanic trans couple? Was it two lesbians? Was it two gay guys? Which one of the couple that you were picturing got upset when we hit turbulence? If you were picturing a male and a female, which one of them got upset? When the pilot came on, who did you picture as the pilot? Was it a white male? Was it someone in a headdress? Was it a small Vietnamese woman? Whatever you pictured isn't good, it isn't bad. There's no evaluation on it. It just is a window, a mirror into what your unconscious biases are. And that's all bias is something to be aware of, not something to shun, right? That, okay, when I hear couple, this is what I think, but I can make that more inclusive. Next place we're going to look is cell and trauma. And that's looking at how trauma affects, right? So at the intersection of cell and trauma, the skill set, the cognitive and cerebral skill set we need is that we know how to ask for help. Asking for help is the difference between life and death at times. That we understand what are our emotional triggers, and once I know them, I can plan for them, right? That's Ross Green, collaborative problem solving, and any other number of ways that we can help a person with their own self-management. That we know that kids who have hyper-aroused nervous systems, need to move, but learning requires movement. So it's not just for trauma. That we know that to be responsible, if we break that word down, says I am able to respond, right? Instead of react. That's that we look at responsibility in way different lens when we talk about my ability to respond. So when we look at hyper-aroused nervous systems, right? That what we're talking about is that fight, flight, or freeze. We're talking about the cues of danger in our world exceed cues of safety. And as soon as that happens, and depending on who I am, that ratio is going to be different. But as soon as cues of danger exceed cues of safety in my environment, I go into fight, flight, or freeze, which is a much older brain, and I lose contact with my prefrontals, with my ability to make good decisions, with my ability to hold things in working memory, right? All the stuff that your prefrontal cortex is responsible for, as soon as you get under stress like that, you don't have access to that. That's why sometimes kids, like, they'll shut down, they're like turtles in their shell, and you can yell, you can prod, you can threaten, and they're not coming out. We need, when kids are when we're in this excited state, we need time and ways. We can learn ways, right? That's what social emotional learning does. It teaches us how to self-regulate. So important when we're talking about these hyper-aroused nervous system, and it's biology. And expect, my lovely educators, enjoy your summer, because when we get back to school after all the chronic stress we're under, I think you're going to have, many of the students are going to be thrilled to be back, but that chronic stress is still going to be simmering in their bodies. So you may see a little bit more of these hyper-aroused nervous systems. And then finally, where trauma and equity overlap, right? That's what we're going to look at now. And where trauma and equity overlap, we're talking about restorative justice, which is responsible decision-making in cell. What do you know about racial and historical trauma? If you don't, that's, one of your focuses over the summer is to become very familiar with that trauma that's embedded in history and in racial. Critical consciousness, which is the ability to think critically and evaluate different systems and happenings around me. Critical consciousness requires learning, and it also requires action, okay? Justice, when we talk about conflict resolution, that's a way that we move towards justice, right? Instead of staying in conflict. Social justice, education, right? And every space is a cell space. If you have conflict occurring on your playground, well, that's where conflict resolution is taught. It's the perfect classroom, right? And that's where most conflict occurs, in open spaces, not in our classrooms. So every space is a cell space. When we're growing, when we're recognizing that underrepresented populations may not feel as welcomed and safe in our schools. So we need to make sure that we raise our awareness, and so that we can see with multiple lenses, so we can make sure we're creating those spaces. So with critical consciousness, right? Examining stereotypes and biases through critical engagement strategies. What you'll see here, this isn't for the pre-K and K through 3 set, okay? This is for kids who have developed a little bit more sophisticated thinking, probably middle school and high school. But we know that's what I always get asked. That's great for elementary school, Sharon, but what about high school and middle school? So this comes right from Teaching Tolerance, or now they've changed their name to Learning for Justice. And here's a strategy you can bring back to your teachers, your school this year. This is critical reading. It's called Reading Against the Grain. And where you start, if we were in person, we would be doing the Cinderella story together to model it. So I'm just going to, pretend we were in breakout rooms, or we were in person and we got together in groups and we looked at, we read Cinderella critically in 3 ways. First, we read it for the dominant reading, right? And dominant means majority, what the majority thinks Cinderella is about. And then we look at reading it with an alternative perspective. What else could be in there? What other message could be Cinderella be sharing if we weren't focused on the dominant version that we've all slurped down for our whole lives? And then finally, resistant. What would be a reading with a resistant focus? And with resistance, you can add a lens. So the lens that I've added is with a gender lens. So this is a feminist reading. But we know that Cinderella, you could read it through a step-family lens. You could read it from a socioeconomic status lens, because Cinderella has no money and all that. But here's, after we would work together, so what's the dominant theme in Cinderella? What do we say it's about? That romantic love survives against all odds, right? This couple meets. They're obviously very attracted to each other, and then fate separates them. But, even though evil forces are working against them, the male and the female get together at the end, right? And everybody lives happily ever after. And we always hope the stepsisters get their due. The alternative to that, if you read it now with critical and you're consciously aware of what you're reading, well, here's this guy who the only thing he looks for in a female is she attractive and does she have small feet, right? And what happens if someone with daintier feet come along? Is he just going to drop Cinderella and go after him? So, right, that a woman's physical appearance is a commodity for her to use to gain social status and wealth. Sorry to be destroying this fairy tale for some of you. All right. So it cautions us now against believing in romantic love. And then finally, if we look at it with the feminist, we see that she's the heroine. She's always been the heroine, right? That she's abused. But the only way she can break free is through a male, right? And she's got to seduce him, and then she's got to ensnare him. So that when you read the story with that lens, um, you see it's a pretty misogynistic tale. When we're talking about that sweet spot where every student, each student in your classroom has access to the material. You want number one, what a great critical reading strategy, right? Literacy. I'm not even talking about the literacy strategies in here. That's just a given. But you have a zillion good literacy strategies. But if the content doesn't engage, if I don't see myself in your content, if I can't access it, I'm not going to process it. When we look to the alternative and the resistant readings and we put that lens on, let's say your class, you're teaching someplace that has a lot of families who are struggling in poverty. Well, we put that lens on it and the kids see themselves and they're able to tear that apart. I think it's a great strategy. So that is a Learning for Justice teaching strategy. It's free. It's available on their website. So what are your next steps? Because that's a lot. That's a lot to think about. But it's a model where we can consolidate our thinking, right? So one of the first things you can do is crosswalk. What are your initiatives? What did you do? Well, not last year, or maybe you did accomplish some initiatives last year besides figuring out how to teach roomers and zoomers at the same time. But what initiatives have you done? Where do they fit in here? What initiatives are you looking to do this year? Are you going headstrong into restorative justice? Are you looking more at equity and social justice? And what are you doing and how does that crosswalk? Is it the juncture of cell and trauma? Is it the juncture of cell and equity? Is it the juncture of equity and trauma? Because when we put them all together, our kids have access so they can process and they can apply. So once you crosswalk your initiatives, where do you want to go first? Where do you want to focus on first? What's already in place, right? That creates our map moving forward so that we can hold on to this promise and not get overwhelmed. So raise your right hand and give yourselves a pat on the back. Holy smokes. If I ran the world, you would all get 5 PhDs because that's what you've earned this last year and a half. Think of who you were in February 2020 compared to who you are now. We've all done a lot of thinking, a lot of reflecting, and we've all grown in huge ways. And you did it while taking care of maybe your own children while you were taking care of your students. And you were helping them to understand, to move through, to cope with not just the pandemic, right? With the social justice movement, with the January 6th insurrection. I mean, what chaotic times we've been through. And yet there you were trying to process things on your own, trying to process with your families, and taking care of your students and their families as well. That you invented ways that you know more than the average bear how much we thrive on connection. And while we were socially isolated, you figured out ways for your own children, for your students to stay connected. And all the while helping everyone process their feelings. Whew. that's you deserve way more than kudos, way more than 5 PhDs. And I just hope you're getting it from all that surrounds you. So any questions, any resources, if you'd like to go deeper, right? We could go so many ways if we were in person when this topic is introduced. And I know your curiosity will take you there. All my contact information is on that slide. You can call, you can email, you can get me through my website. I would love to hear your thoughts. Enjoy the rest of your summer. Remember balance and boundaries and self-care.